What if I told you that the biggest threat to our freshwater isn't actually some towering industrial pipe pumping out neon green sludge?
Right, which is what we all picture.
Exactly. But instead, it's the headache pill you took this morning. Or, the water-resistant winter jacket that's currently sitting in your washing machine.
It really completely upends the conventional wisdom. I mean, we are so conditioned to view environmental threats through this lens of, like, mid-20th century industrial villains.
Yeah.
But the empirical reality of our water systems has just shifted entirely over the last few decades.
And that is exactly why you and I are here today. For this deep dive, our mission is to step back from those inherently panic-inducing headlines you always see about shrinking reservoirs and dry earth.
Which are everywhere.
They really are. We want to look at the cold, hard data. We want to uncover the actual empirical state of our fresh water supply. And to do that, we are looking at a remarkably comprehensive piece of source material. It's a 2018 report by the Fraser Institute titled Evaluating the State of Freshwater in Canada.
Right, and just a quick note for you before we dive into the numbers. Our source today is from a well-known think tank. And our goal here isn't to endorse their specific viewpoints or, political stances. We are simply going to impartially unpack the data, the historical trends, and the underlying environmental mechanisms they've aggregated in this report.
So you can weigh the reality of the situation for yourself.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Before we even start worrying about what microscopic compounds might be floating around inside the water, we need to address the most fundamental baseline question.
Are we running out of it?
Right. Is the vault emptying out?
Well, the short answer is a definitive no. When you look at the raw hydrological numbers, Canada holds the third largest renewable freshwater supply in the entire world.
Third largest. Wow.
Yeah. The average annual flow is something like 3,478 cubic kilometers of water.
To put that in perspective for you, it works out to over 100,000 cubic meters per person every single year.
It's massive.
It is an almost unfathomable volume of liquid.
It is, yeah. But there is a geographical quirk to this abundance. While the overarching supply is staggering, it's not evenly distributed where the demand is.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Well, the vast majority of Canada's fresh water naturally drains northward. It flows up into the Arctic Ocean and Hudson Bay.
Right, so it flows entirely away from the people because most of the Canadian population lives densely packed along the southern border.
Exactly.
So Canada's water supply is essentially like this vast trust fund where the beneficiary lives too far away to easily access the main vault.
That's a great way to put it.
But based on the data, that geographical mismatch doesn't really matter because we are only spending pennies anyway.
Right. And what's fascinating here is that the popular narrative of an impending water shortage directly contradicts the data on our actual consumption.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When researchers calculate all the water withdrawn for household use, agriculture, and industry, Canadians are consuming roughly 1% of their annual renewable supply.
Wait, just 1%?
Just 1%. The data proves that sheer quantity is not our crisis. In fact, environmental monitoring stations in 2015 showed that 65% of monitored rivers had totally normal baseline flow quantities.
That is wild. And the breakdown of who is actually withdrawing that 1% is genuinely surprising. Like,
Yeah.
if you had asked me to guess the biggest water consumer, I'd probably say agriculture.
Sure, most people would.
Or maybe just residential neighborhoods running their sprinklers all summer. But household use only accounts for 9% of total withdrawals.
Barely a dent.
Yeah. The absolute behemoth, responsible for 67%, is thermal power generation.
Yes. And we need to look at the mechanical reality of how that water is used because, and this is key, withdrawal does not always mean consumption.
Okay, explain that.
So thermal power plants, which generate electricity by creating steam to turn massive turbines, they withdraw immense volumes of water, primarily for cooling purposes.
Oh, right, because those things get incredibly hot.
Exactly. The sheer thermal inertia required to operate those plants demands a constant flow of cool liquid. But they don't consume it in the biological way a field of crops does.
So it doesn't just disappear into a plant or evaporate away entirely.
Right. The vast majority of that water is returned directly to the source.
Albeit at a slightly higher temperature, which alters the local microecosystem, sure, but the volume itself remains in the watershed.
Precisely. And if we look strictly at the quantity of residential usage, the trends are actually moving downward.
Which is another surprise.
Yeah. The report tracked daily per capita household water use. And it dropped from 330 liters in 2005 to 250 liters in 2013.
That is a profound reduction in less than a decade.
It really is.
And that wasn't achieved by people suddenly taking 2-minute cold showers or, just stop washing their hands.
Thankfully, no.
It's a testament to passive technological improvements. The engineering of our everyday appliances simply got better. High-efficiency toilets, smarter washing machines that actually weigh the load to optimize water levels, and aerated low-flow shower heads.
We basically reduced the demand on the system through better design.
Right, without requiring a drastic behavioral sacrifice from the public.
So, the overarching bank account is full, we're withdrawing a tiny fraction, and our daily efficiency is improving.
Which is all good news.
Yes. But if sheer volume isn't the pressing issue, the logical next step is to examine the chemical and biological quality of the water we actually interact with.
Right. Let's get into the Water Quality Index, or WQI. The report uses this metric to grade the rivers and lakes.
The WQI is a rigorous system. It measures a variety of specific parameters, things like dissolved oxygen, pH levels, turbidity, heavy metals, and nutrient loads.
Lots of variables.
Exactly. And it takes those readings and compares them against strict scientific guidelines designed to protect sensitive aquatic life. And on a macro level, the results are quite encouraging.
Yeah, between 2014 and 2016, 82% of the monitoring stations across the country registered as fair, good, or excellent.
Which is great. Only 2% were rated poor and 16% were marginal.
And it's not just a lucky snapshot either. It's a stable trend line. Looking at longitudinal data from 2002 to 2016, 81% of the sites showed absolutely zero change in overall water quality.
Right.
But here is the major pivot in the data, and it totally upended my assumptions about where pollution actually comes from today.
This is the big reveal.
Yeah. When they categorized the sources of water pollution releases, manufacturing accounted for only 7%.
Only 7%.
A staggering 88% of water pollution releases come from a category labeled Other, which is predominantly driven by municipal wastewater treatment plants.
It's a bizarre paradigm shift, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, wait a second. When we think of water pollution, we picture giant industrial pipes. Are you telling me my toilet and my kitchen sink are collectively a bigger problem than a factory?
Basically, yes. It is a profound shift in the regulatory landscape.
That's correct.
Well, the image of the industrial pipe is ingrained in our cultural consciousness because legacy industrial pollution was a massive, highly visible crisis in the mid-20th century.
Right. Rivers catching on fire, things like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But because point source pollution is so easily tied to a specific geographic origin, like you can literally put a flow meter on a single discharge pipe, it was highly targetable by government regulations.
Oh, that makes sense. The authorities could point to a specific corporate entity and say, install scrubbers on this pipe, or we shut you down.
And those stringent regulations forced a technological revolution in industrial abatement.
Right.
The report highlights the pulp and paper industry as a prime example. Back in 1985, pulp and paper mills had an abysmal 25% passing rate for fish toxicity tests.
So their effluent was highly lethal.
Very lethal. But because of intense regulatory pressure, the industry adopted closed-loop water systems and chemical recovery processes. So by 2014, that passing rate had skyrocketed to 97.5%.
Wow, from 25 to 97.5%.
Yeah. And we saw similar dramatic drops in heavy metals. Lead releases dropped by 70% and cadmium by 61%.
And we've even seen significant progress on the domestic agricultural front, too. Household use of chemical lawn fertilizers and pesticides dropped sharply between 1994 and 2015.
Right. So the historical point source pollution has been largely wrestled under control.
But the pressure hasn't disappeared.
No, it hasn't. It has merely shifted to the overwhelming density of urban populations.
Millions of people clustered in concrete centers, all showering, doing laundry, and sending everything down the drain into municipal wastewater plants.
Which perfectly explains the complex modern chemical profiles now showing up in the aquatic food web.
Because we aren't just flushing biological waste anymore. We are flushing the microscopic chemical footprint of a highly synthetic modern lifestyle.
Exactly.
Let's talk about the specific chemicals because this is where the biology gets fascinating. The report focuses on toxic substances like PBDEs, which are flame retardants woven into our furniture and electronics,
Right.
and PFOS, which are the chemicals used in nonstick pans and water-resistant clothing. Now, the good news is that manufacturing regulations have caused these chemicals to stabilize or decrease.
Right, but the bad news is they still exceed safety guidelines in densely populated watersheds, like the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River.
Why is that?
Well, the reason they exceed those guidelines comes down to their molecular structure. The carbon-fluorine bond in chemicals like PFOS is one of the strongest bonds in organic chemistry.
Okay.
That stability is exactly why they are so great at repelling stains on your jacket, but it also means they do not readily break down in nature. They stick around forever.
And that leads to the issue with the fish. The data shows that PFOS levels in fish tissue usually meet the basic health guidelines for the fish themselves. So the fish seem fine,
Right.
but they routinely fail the wildlife diet guidelines.
Yes. And this requires us to look at the cellular mechanism of bioaccumulation. Because these specific synthetic chemicals are fat-soluble rather than water-soluble, an animal's liver cannot easily metabolize or excrete them.
So they just stay in the body.
Exactly. When a fish absorbs a tiny, non-lethal amount of a stain-repellent chemical, it locks permanently into their lipid tissues.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah. Now, as you move up the trophic level, say, an osprey or a bear eating hundreds of those fish over a season, those persistent chemicals multiply exponentially.
Because the predator absorbs the lifetime chemical burden of every single prey it consumes.
Exactly. Concentrating the toxins to dangerous levels at the top of the food chain.
Here's where it gets really interesting and honestly a little surreal. The chemical footprint isn't limited to industrial retardants. A 2014 study focused on the St. Lawrence River downstream of Montreal, and they tested for PPCPs.
Pharmaceuticals and personal care products.
Right, and what they found was that the river is essentially caffeinated and heavily medicated.
It's wild. The water column was laced with highly detectable levels of acetaminophen, which is the active ingredient in Tylenol, along with ibuprofen, caffeine, and even synthetic cholesterol.
But wait, how does a staggering amount of ibuprofen bypass the system and end up free-floating in a major commercial waterway?
It all comes down to the fundamental engineering limitations of our wastewater infrastructure. When you ingest a pharmaceutical, your body only metabolizes a specific fraction of the active compound.
Right, and the remainder is excreted.
Exactly. It travels through the sewer to the municipal treatment plant. But the critical issue is that those plants were designed in the mid-20th century to filter out human biological waste, harmful bacteria, and, large suspended solids.
They use screens and settling tanks?
Right, biological aeration.
Yeah.
But they were never engineered to filter out complex, microscopic pharmaceutical compounds at the molecular level. So those dissolved drugs pass right through the final filtration stages and discharge directly into the river.
So what does a medicated river actually do to the ecosystem? I mean, is a fish swimming in Tylenol biologically compromised?
It is severely compromised, and this is the biological so what of urban wastewater. Many of these substances act as endocrine disruptors.
Okay, meaning they mess with hormones.
Yes. The endocrine system relies on specific hormones to regulate growth, metabolism, and reproduction. The synthetic hormones from birth control pills, or the chemical binders in cosmetics, are structurally similar enough to natural hormones that they act like fake keys fitting into the cellular locks of aquatic life.
So they trick the animal's biology into reacting.
Exactly. When aquatic life is constantly bathed in these disruptive chemicals, it scrambles their internal signaling. The report explicitly highlights that these specific compounds can feminize male fish and freshwater mussels.
Wow.
It suppresses their natural biological development, completely disrupting their ability to reproduce, which threatens the sudden, invisible collapse of localized populations.
That is deeply unsettling. Our personal, everyday consumption, taking a headache pill to get through a workday, or washing a chemically treated raincoat bypasses our infrastructure and physically rewires the biology of the wildlife downstream.
It highlights how utterly connected the urban environment is to the natural one.
It really does. And because human density is the primary driver of this specific chemical load, the report reveals a stark geographical divide when analyzing water quality across the country.
Right. When you look at the national map of the Water Quality Index, the disparity is profound.
The pristine watersheds are located precisely where human density is lowest.
The Arctic and Atlantic regions, These are vast, largely undeveloped areas where the water quality consistently registers as overwhelmingly excellent or good.
But I actually want to push back on one specific data point from the northern watershed because it feels completely counterintuitive.
Okay, what is it?
The report claims that the Athabasca region, which is internationally known for the heavy industrial extraction of oil sands, has generally very good water quality.
Right.
It notes exceedances in heavy metals like iron, aluminum, and copper, but classifies them as naturally occurring.
Yes, it does.
But how can scientists definitively separate historical natural baseline metals from new mining runoff? I mean, how do they know the extraction industry isn't the primary source of those spikes? Isn't that counterintuitive?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it's a perfect example of how empirical data can sometimes challenge our assumptions.
Okay.
Because it is entirely logical to assume that heavy earth-moving equipment and extraction processes are causing those specific metal spikes. However, hydrologists and geologists look at historical baseline data.
Like older records.
Yeah, core samples and river gauges dating back to the 1990s, long before the industry reached its current scale. The Athabasca River system physically cuts through geological strata that are inherently naturally rich in those specific metallic compounds.
Oh, I see. So the river is essentially washing over an exposed vein of iron and copper anyway.
Precisely. The high concentrations were present in the water decades ago. Now, this doesn't mean the oil sands industry has zero environmental impact. There are entirely separate discussions about tailings, ponds, and land use, but the data confirms that the specific baseline metal exceedances in the flowing river system are a product of the Earth itself.
Not the machinery operating on top of it.
Exactly.
Okay, so if the northern geography represents the pristine and naturally rugged water systems, where are the stressed regions?
The stressed regions correlate perfectly with population density and intensive agriculture.
Makes sense.
Yeah, the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River region, which houses 60% of all Canadians along with the prairie provinces, they have the highest frequency of marginal and poor water quality ratings.
And when we examine the prairies and the Great Lakes, the primary stressor isn't just municipal wastewater, it's agricultural runoff.
Very much so.
The report points specifically to Lake Erie and Lake Winnipeg, both of which suffer from severely poor phosphorus levels.
And this introduces a highly destructive ecological process called eutrophication.
Right.
In modern agriculture, farmers apply phosphorus-rich fertilizers to stimulate rapid crop growth. But during heavy rain events, the unabsorbed fertilizer washes off the soil surface, drains into the tributaries, and eventually pools in shallow, warm basins like Lake Erie and Lake Winnipeg.
And phosphorus performs the exact same function in the water that it does on land, right? It acts as a biological accelerant.
Exactly. It supercharges the growth of a local plant life. It fuels massive, unnatural blooms of toxic cyanobacteria, commonly known as blue-green algae.
Which I've seen pictures of. It's awful.
Yeah, these blooms can grow so vast they are literally visible from space, and they completely blanket the surface of a lake, preventing sunlight from penetrating the water column.
But the real devastation happens when the algae inevitably dies and sinks to the bottom.
Yes, because the decomposition process requires oxygen.
A tremendous amount of it.
The bacteria responsible for breaking down the dead algae consume the dissolved oxygen budget of the surrounding water.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this causes a severe biological oxygen demand spike, creating hypoxic dead zones, vast underwater areas so entirely depleted of oxygen that native fish, crustaceans, and insects literally suffocate.
The really frustrating aspect of this is that the scientific community has understood the vulnerability of the Great Lakes for a long time. We've seen incredible triumphs there in the past, but the report notes that progress is stalling.
Right.
For instance, legacy mercury levels in Lake Erie fish had been dropping steadily since the regulatory clampdowns in the 1970s. But the recent data indicates that this improvement has plateaued and in some areas is actually slightly reversing.
Which raises a vital point about the nature of environmental stewardship. Solving a complex ecological problem once does not guarantee it remains solved indefinitely.
Yeah.
The drastic reduction of industrial mercury in the 1970s was a monumental triumph of targeted regulation. But the stalling progress today demonstrates that environmental systems are dynamic, not static.
Right. As global climate patterns shift water temperatures and as surrounding land use changes, the pressures on the watershed evolve.
It requires unyielding, constant scientific vigilance.
So what does this all mean for us? If we zoom out and synthesize this incredibly dense stack of regional data, the overarching takeaway is surprisingly reassuring on a macro scale.
It really is.
We are not facing a catastrophic shortage of water. We are sitting on an immense renewable reserve, and our daily household efficiency is measurably improving. The water is generally safe, heavily monitored, and the era of unchecked, highly toxic industrial point source dumping is largely behind us.
That is the core narrative of the data. The true crisis isn't a lack of quantity, nor is it a wholesale failure of broad water quality. The real story is the fundamental evolution in the nature of water pollution.
Yeah, the threats are no longer concentrated at the end of a single factory pipe.
No, they are highly diffuse, incredibly complex, and intimately connected to our daily modern existence. It's the invisible runoff from the agriculture that feeds us and the microscopic pharmaceutical and chemical residues flowing out of our own municipal infrastructure.
It genuinely forces you to reevaluate your relationship with the drain in your kitchen sink.
It does.
And that brings us to a final thought for you to ponder. Throughout this deep dive, we've shifted from the loud, panic-inducing headlines to the quiet, complex, and highly connected reality of our water systems.
Right.
We've established that the primary stress on our water is driven by geographical density, millions of people clustered in the southern watersheds, far away from the vast, pristine northern reserves.
The geographical mismatch is truly the defining feature of the system.
Consider this. If our current water abundance is locked in the north, draining away from the heavily populated, agriculturally stressed southern border, what happens to this dynamic in the coming decades?
That's the big question.
As global climate pressures intensify, accelerating the push for arable land and potentially driving massive human migration further north into currently undeveloped territories, how will that alter the map?
Will we naturally close that geographical gap and access the pristine vault?
Or, by moving the population, will we simply drag the diffuse, invisible stresses of modern municipal wastewater and agricultural runoff straight into the heart of the untouched Arctic watersheds?
It's a fascinating, daunting question.
It really is. It makes you wonder about how our shifting footprint will eventually rewrite the map of our most vital resource.